I've heard from countless members of the FBI that are grateful and thankful for the president's decision. And I think that, we may have to agree to disagree. We're not going to get into a numbers game. I mean, I have heard from a large number of individuals that work at the FBI that said that they're very happy with the president's decision.
You repeated the claims, slip of the tongue, several times. What exactly did you mean to say? Because you appeared to be reading you appeared to be reading those comments on several occasions. What did you mean to say?
Look, I've acknowledged that the word countless was a slip of the tongue.
Why can't you acknowledge that what you said then was not true?
I said that the word I used, countless, and I also said if you look at what's in quotations for me, it's that. And it's that it was in the heat of the moment, meaning that it wasn't a scripted talking point. I'm sorry that I wasn't a robot like the Democrat Party.
White House Press Secretary Sarah.
Just so you know, if I'm not reading it off a script, I'm allowed to lie.
You can say anything you want.
I'm totally allowed to lie.
You can say anything you want. Right. There's certain jobs, yours, mine, hers, where we're actually paid not to do that, right?
Our standards department is passing.
Because right now this isn't scripted.
It's not on a script. I'm
You say anything you want.
Yeah.
That was the White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders playing defense today following revelations in Robert Mueller's 400-page report that she did in fact mislead the American people to defend President Trump. Now, according to the report, Sanders admitted she lied to reporters about FBI staffers losing confidence in former FBI Director James Comey and later said it was, quote, not founded on anything. But Sanders isn't the only White House staffer mentioned by the special counsel for obeying potentially problematic actions, which could seem like obstruction at President Trump's request. There's also Reince Priebus, the president's former chief of staff. He disseminated false information to the Washington Post after Trump expressed his displeasure with a story that appeared in January of 2017. And then there's Stephen Miller, the president's current senior policy advisor. He drafted a letter regarding Comey's firing in which it was explicitly written that Comey informed Trump on 3 separate occasions that he was not under investigation. But the focus today is also on those in Trump's orbit who defied his requests. That's because in the report, Robert Mueller writes, quote, the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out his orders to accede to his requests. All right, let's tick through some of those people and who they are. First of all, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats. He refused to say publicly that no link existed between President Trump and Russia after he was asked to say that in the Oval Office in 2017. James Comey. He defied the president's request to publicly push back on the suggestion that the president had a connection to the Russian election interference. Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, and former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Rick Dearborn, they both did not deliver Trump's message to then Attorney General Jeff Sessions that he should confine the Russia investigation to future election interference only.
Ali, can you just, I want to make sure we make something clear. At the time, Corey Lewandowski did not work for President Trump.
Correct.
He has never been part of the administration.
Right.
So technically, the President of the United States called up a private citizen and said, can you call the Attorney General of the United States of America and influence him? That is like me calling you and saying, yo, Ali, you've got Jeff Sessions on TV later tonight during the commercial break. Can you hit him up with X?
Correct.
That's crazy. Think about that in terms of national security.
And he's not the only one. Corey Lewandowski, who, by the way, is thought of as somebody who does often do the president's bidding, he said no. Former White House counsel Don McGahn, he refused to ask Rod Rosenstein to fire Mueller and threatened to resign instead after the president asked him to do, quote, crazy, using a word that I can't use on TV. And then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, he recused himself from the investigation despite Trump asking him not to do so. And Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, he refused to hold a press conference at Trump's direction to take responsibility himself for the firing of James Comey. So interesting that in all of these, the report is very, very clear about this. Donald Trump asked a lot of people to do things that are at best immoral and at worst something more. And a bunch of people said no.
Joining us now, Axios editor-in-chief Nick Johnston. Nick, when we walk through that list, NBC has actually counted up 11 total staffers or allies mentioned in the report who the president asked them to do something and they referred. Many people in the last 24 hours are looking at this list and saying, wow, turns out these people are heroes. Are they heroes, or were they just trying to save themselves? Because of that list,
by not breaking the law.
there's a whole lot of people on there who weren't whistleblowers, who didn't stand up and quit. They went right back to work for the president the next day.
Yeah, we don't know the motivations of that. I think that's a really fascinating question. Sort of like, why do they decide to do those kinds of things? We haven't really unpacked all of that. But sort of like what stopped me in my tracks when I was reading it yesterday, seeing that Corey Lewandowski, who was an enforcer for the president, who always did with the president, like he at this point was like, you know what, I'm actually not.
Though he didn't detail that in his tell-all book about the president. He didn't talk about the president's wrongdoing or bad intentions there.
No, of course not. But we don't know why he decided at this moment not to do that. And I think that's what's really interesting. And sort of like, much more so in Don McGahn, we do know, sort of like, has he referred to himself in the Mueller report as a real lawyer, which is why he took contemporaneous notes on all these kinds of things and sort of actually took steps, prepared a resignation. It's like, if the president makes me do this, this is Nixonian, I'm quitting.
Right.
Hold on. Do you know that Don McGahn told the president he was a real lawyer when the president was saying to him, why can't you be more like
Roy Cohn?
Roy Cohn, who was disbarred.
Right.
Disbarred.
So let me ask you this, given that we've had 24 hours to think about this. If these people, some of these 11 people who we just put up on the screen, Dan Coates, James Comey, Corey Lewandowski, Rick Dearborn, Don McGahn, others, if they had done the president's bidding, would we be having a different conversation? Would this report look different?
I don't think so. Like, I read very closely the way Mueller at the very end tries to weigh in if his role to say whether there's obstruction of justice or not, whether if he were to say that, what kind of impact that would have on the presidency. I think he very clearly realizes when it's the president we're talking about here, it's not up to a special counsel. It's a political discussion for Congress to have. I think we'd be having a very different conversation in Congress about the next steps. But they're even already, they want the full report. They're going to call Mueller before the committee. Terry Nadler said yesterday, we're going to follow the investigation wherever the evidence leads. I think they're going to dig into that. I think regardless, it would have been Congress's decision to make that call. Mueller showed no sense of jumping into that.
Interesting. All right, Nick, good to see you as always. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Nick Johnson.
Can I just ask he watches cable news. Can I ask the president one question?
Yeah.
If real lawyers don't take notes, why do they call those yellow lined, really extra long notepads? Why do they call them legal pads? Just wondering.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.